Hi, dear listeners, and welcome back to Blush and Bloom, the podcast where we talk about women's health, self care, and everything in between. I'm your host, Gigi, founder of Asele, your space for cycle aware and preventive care. I'm really glad you're here with me on this journey to unpack women's health and highlight the incredible things being built in this space. So, let's get into today's episode. All right. Hi, Valerie. Thank you so much for joining me on the Blush and Bloom podcast. So, for those meeting you for the first time, how do you describe yourself and the work that you do?
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast today. My name is Valerie. I guess predominantly I am a clinician. That is my background. That's what I currently work in. But on the side, I've always run a series of non-clinical related projects. So during medical school, I had two startups, one after the other. And then now that I'm in medical residency, I have a foundation called XX Combinator. And what we do is we support women's health innovators through all of the main bottlenecks that might stop innovation, but particularly across funding, data, and operational support.
Okay, awesome. That's really, really interesting. And you wear a lot of hats, like you're a doctor, you're a founder, and you're the co-founder of XX Combinator. So how do all these roles connect for you?
Yeah, I would say the main way they connect is out of my own interests, I guess. That's really what drew me to entrepreneurship in the first place was that I was seeing a lot of need in the clinical space. Um, and I felt like I needed an outlet to do something towards fixing that. And that's how it's continued over the years. There's obviously loads of places and different clinical settings where you can make an impact. But for me personally, what resonated the most was in women's health.
Okay, so you've already touched on this a little bit, but what drew you? Do you have like a personal experience that drew you into it, that drew you towards women's health and innovation specifically?
Yeah, so so I guess let's start with what drew me to innovation, which was a much more straightforward story, which was when COVID started, I was in the first year of medical school, and I suddenly found myself with a lot more free time because we stopped being able to go into university because of COVID, and it was just very uncertain what the future of this medical degree was going to look like. And so I was like, okay, I feel like this is like a blessing in disguise. I have so much free time. Let me find something new to do. And my university had a entrepreneurship institute. So they sent an email around. I don't think it was timed with COVID or anything, but I just happened to see it when I was thinking this. And then I was like, oh, maybe this is something I'd be interested in. Asked around. One of my friends had co founded a startup during his last degree and he was looking to pick it back up. So I was like, yeah, I'll do it with you. So I learned a bit about entrepreneurship through doing that startup, which was completely unrelated from women's health. It was on urinary catheters. And then I really took that time to explore what I might be interested in doing. I had a really impactful placement at a mother and baby unit, which is a mental health treatment center for predominantly mums, or I guess entirely mums, but their partners come sometimes as well, from the time of pregnancy to up to 2 years postpartum. So I got to see some really interesting and impactful stories of mental health from the perspective of a woman with young children. And I think that was my gateway of interest into the women's health sector.
All right, that's really cool. So my question now for you is like, how are you able to balance all these things that you do? How do you make time for all of them? Because you're a doctor, you're a founder. How are you able to like balance all the things that you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really have any concrete planning tips. I know some people, they're really good at like time blocking and things like that. I'm not really like that. I think I just try and fit everything around as well as I can. And also, things aren't equally busy throughout the year. So, for example, in my clinical work, when I'm doing ward based work, it's definitely busier towards like flu season. So, like autumn, winter. Whereas with the startup stuff, it can be different times of the year or just whenever conversations really pick up. And you can really direct that. So, especially with the stuff I do outside of clinical, because I'm not being paid for it, I really set the pace. And that's how I'm able to sort of slow things down or speed things up depending on how much time I have.
Okay. So I was going through your work history, and I see you started Puffin. From what I understand, it's a safe space for young women to learn about fertility and identity, and then you stepped away from it when your residency began. But how was that for you, and what was the journey like?
Yeah, Puffin actually started as a perinatal mental health digital platform. So our original USP, as it were, was to match mums of similar features to each other. So whether it was the stage of pregnancy they were in, or how many children they had, or their ethnic or religious background, we would match them together in a group and they would be able to talk about their experiences and support each other. It was really hard to demo this pilot, this kind of platform, just because I think we didn't have like a lot of easy access to mums. So I'm not a mum myself. But we did do, I think we surveyed like over 120 mums. So it was definitely a validated idea. It was just when it came to actually building out the pilot, is a lot of work because you're having to keep this group of people you don't know super well engaged, and some of them um, are can be quite emotional just with their experience. We just felt like as medical students, it was really difficult for us to manage that. It felt a bit unsafe. So we were like, why don't we just pivot to something more neutral, which is to talk about fertility for young women. Young women being anyone, within the fertile age. So not like with specific age cutoffs. So we talked about egg freezing, we talked about um I think we talked about surrogacy, that kind of stuff. And so it was a platform that we were going to develop in that direction. I would say I really wish we had built all of that now with all of these new AI tools out, because at that time we were like trying to pilot the core idea, but also like not really knowing how to build out the platform. And it was just really difficult and felt like it was going to be really expensive. And so it was really slow. Whereas now I feel like we could probably have built the platform out in like 2, 3 hours. So that's a bit annoying. But basically, what we learned was that there's a lot of confusion between young women about the different options they have regarding their fertility, different costs, what the process is actually like, especially with egg freezing, which is one of the first topics we covered. The industry is really opaque. So the upfront costs and the procedure aren't clearly understood. And for whatever reason, there's not, even when you go on the pages, like the web pages of companies that do egg freezing, it's not laid out in a really straightforward, easy to understand way. I guess partially because it's also a business. So they want to make it seem like it's a bit cheaper than it actually is. But that was really interesting because I also was able to understand the differences between innovation within women's health versus other med tech, health tech sectors. And one of the things that I started realizing was that even though the founders are equally qualified, driven, motivated, the sector was getting a lot less funding. It's partially because the founders are female, partially because traditionally we haven't had a lot of women in the investment sector, particularly for early stage investment, so venture capital. And so that was when I was like, okay, maybe this is something I'd like to focus on next. Um, and then I was like, let me just pack this all up and focus on just being a doctor. And that quickly didn't work because someone was like, do you want to build out what is now XX Combinator? And I was like, sure.
That's really cool. This brings me to like two separate questions, one about the VC side and another one outside of about the AI side. So for like, I love that you mentioned like AI is very relevant now because it's easier for founders to quickly prototype out their idea and test it. So I wanted to get your thoughts on AI being used in FemTech. Like, where do you see this going?
Yeah, this is super interesting because I feel like women's health founders, personally, I don't use the term femtech. We can get into that later. But women's health founders, I feel, for whatever reason, maybe partially because like traditionally, like coding and like computer science hasn't been emphasized as important for women to learn, or I guess a lot of it is parental as well. Like when you go through school, like if your parents don't feel like it is appropriate or as important from a girl to learn coding and computer science, you're going to be a little bit more hesitant to use these tools. And there's a lot of these tools coming out now that really shorten the process from idea to like your minimum viable product, which is like the first draft of your product. So I would say that I don't see women's health founders embracing these new AI tools as much as they should be. I think more of them can because a lot of them the tools are very cheap. And they're quite good. There's a lot of variation in the types of tools that are out there now. I guess some of the examples I can give are tools like Lovable, tools like Bolt, New, React. All of these don't require you to have any technical background. You can just prompt the tool similar to how you would prompt ChatGPT, and it will spit out a very basic version of whatever platform you're trying to build. And then what I kind of see people getting bogged down with then is like they don't like how the interface looks. So if you don't like how the interface looks, you can go on another platform called Figma, build out how you want the interface to look, and then you can link the two together, the back end and the front end. Or at that point, you can take the code that the first build that you have and then bring someone with a technical background on just to make some tweaks. But you shouldn't be paying a lot of money or much money at all for this. And you definitely shouldn't at this point be looking for venture capital funding.
I have another question.
Of course.
Because like I think I've seen some founders like launch even without having their product live. So what do you think about like people who approach it this way? Like they raise first and then build out later. Like I don't know what their approach is on the back end, but then it's like you hear a company has raised so amount and then they're still like sometimes they're not even in beta, it's just behind a wall or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I would say for these examples, I would look very closely at who the founders are, and you would find a lot of your answers there. So when we say they raise pre-product, a lot of that doesn't mean they don't have any product at all. It means that they have at least a minimum viable product and they're just iterating on that product. And that's why they haven't even gone beta yet. So they haven't finished the first version, but they probably have the core of the product is already proven. Alternatively, founders might be second time founders is what I would say. Second time founders always raise easier than first time founders. But the problem is with women, particularly, that the proportion of women who have already raised enough to sell a company and become a second time founder is so small. The pool of people is so small that if you're listening to this, you probably don't sit in that category because these are people, for example, like Lucy Guo, who is like the co-founder of Scale AI. She can raise pre-product for sure, no problem. But you won't be able to raise if you don't have any background in entrepreneurship, any background in fundraising, any background in product, just because the risk of an investor putting that amount of money into you pre-product is so large that they probably won't do it. And I say probably, I mean like most likely won't do it.
Okay, sorry. I was trying to like search for the name. When you said Scale AI, my brain just like went like 360 because
No, that's fine.
this book, Empire of AI by Karen Howe. And it's about like open AI. And then it mentioned like a lot of the practices that happen at Scale AI and how unethical they are. And mentioned the company. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. I mean, she's like a female founder, right? She now has her second company. She was able to raise, I mean, she talks about this on her podcast all the time. She was able to raise over WhatsApp in a few hours.
Makes
Like
sense.
she put it out in a WhatsApp group and then she closed in a few hours and it was, I can't remember the exact figure, millions, I'm sure at minimum. These are not realistic expectations for the average female founder to have for themselves, even the average exited women's health female founder, just because people are having to fundraise months, even years to raise their target that I see sometimes, which is compared to like if you're trying to raise for a B2B SaaS in like San Francisco, the figure is like a fraction of that. And you have to raise for much longer. You have to prove much more things. First, because it's in health tech. Secondly, probably because you're an inexperienced founder. And thirdly, because you're a woman. So these are all of the things you need to be overcoming. And I think that just means as well, like, I think a lot of people here, like, get quite downtrodden when they heard this. I think what that just means is that fundamentally, when women, and particularly women's health founders, approach fundraising, you need to break your traditional view of what fundraising is going to look like for you. So a lot of the more successful fundraisers I've seen, they only raise when they really need to raise. So they bootstrapped, i.e., they like created savings for themselves from their day job or from whatever else, to the point where when they were able to raise, their company was later into that product development process, or they found people to de-risk this investment. So, for example, if you find someone from an exited company, or if you find someone who was like the first hire of, like, I don't know, Scale AI, Airbnb, those types of large companies, it's easy for you to raise if you don't come from this background.
I think, sorry, I was trying to like bring together when you said something like, I think I saw somewhere like somebody was saying, and I think it was a newsletter, I can't remember which one I read, and the person was saying that a tip for people who want to fundraise would be to go to already established companies like Scale AI, Airbnb, and then find the early employees, like the first set of employees, and then approach them if they would like to be investors because they're more likely to cash in on their shares or something.
I mean, if you know those people, sure, but I think most of us don't, right?
Yeah.
Let's be realistic. I think most of us don't. We're not in those rooms, and if we are in those rooms, we wouldn't be here sitting here talking about how hard fundraising is because you already would have raised. The people that have success with those techniques oftentimes are already friends with people who have a lot of spare cash and probably have a lot of spare cash themselves. Just to give an example again, one of the most common AIs that I use in clinical practice is called oh my God, I have to say this right, Open Evidence, I think. Yes, it's called Open Evidence. I always get the name wrong. Open Evidence is a AI tool that summarizes the latest clinical research for different diseases. And so I ask it a lot of clinical questions so I know up to date with the most new research, what the best clinical practices are, how much of what drug to prescribe, etc. Open Evidence is founded by someone who doesn't work in health tech, who had a lot of success with his first startup, which I think was also an AI, was able to fund the majority of the platform himself, to the point where when he then found venture capital investment, this kind of accelerated his progress so much that he's now a billionaire, I'm pretty sure. So he knows the investors that already trust him from his first fundraise and are more likely to invest in him again. In addition, he's already de-risked the investment by investing so much of his own money in it himself, and also he has a good track record, right? So realistically, when you think about like fundraising, how are you going to compete with there's a limited amount of money, like all VC funds have a limited amount of money. How are you going to compete with people like this to get someone else's investment? If you're like, I don't want to spend all of my time thinking about this. I want to spend more of my time thinking about my product, my users, my community, etc. Oftentimes a better way to go about it is either bootstrap, look for grant funding, you can crowdfund, and there's no shame in any of these processes. I think a lot of times founders are just pushed towards VC funding because that's what gets the flashiest headlines and that's what
Mhm.
gets you the most like applause or whatever,
Attention.
founder. But realistically, you really need to make sure you're clear on what your aim is as a founder and use that to dictate what path in your raise process you want.
Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so let's talk more about XX Combinator. So you are tackling critical bottlenecks in health tech for women. So what do these bottlenecks tend to look like from your perspective?
Yeah. I mean, super good question at this point because we've already covered the majority of them. One is
Yeah.
fundraising. I think there's really poor understanding from women's health founders about what the different fundraising options are, when you should go for the raise, what the raise should be used for, what to look for on your term sheets, and what life looks like after raising. Because people think kind of raising, you get the money, that's great. It's all like sunshine and butterflies, but it's not. Like, soon as you take someone's money, you're liable for use of that money. So
Mm.
then there's a huge ticking time clock on your success after you fundraise. And the more money you take, the bigger the
Yeah.
clock
Sure.
gets, the faster it starts ticking. Because you need to update your investors every quarter, ideally at minimum, until you sell the company. And when you even before you get to that, there's often lots of friction with when you bring on investors. Some of them sit on your board, and then they have differing opinions about the direction of the business, who to hire, when to sell, things like that. So it becomes less and less your business the more and more external investment you take on. So that's one, fundraising. The second is data. So I think data is really interesting because in women's health recently, we've seen a lot of uproar about the way data is being handled, especially because it's sensitive data that now in certain countries can be used against women, to make their lives more unsafe and make the providers of care have more unsafe lives as well. So, I mean, the biggest example is Flow. I'm sure everyone's aware of the lawsuits that have happened regarding data privacy. So, one of our aims is to educate founders on what good data management looks like. And in a few months, we're going to have a webinar on data strategy from 0 to 1, explaining what that is, how you can start implementing it, even if you're pre product. What are safe ways to store your data, manage your data? How do you decide what data you need to be collecting in the first place? And, as you go forward and your data management becomes more complex, how you can make sure that this is done in a way that is manageable for you. The third thing that we really focus on is operator support. So this is kind of a broader one. Within that, we particularly see technical operations support as an area where women's health founders really lack. Oftentimes, again, because of the founder cohort, we most often see female founders, first time founders, and founders from non technical backgrounds. That is like I would say, the majority of founders in women's health that I've met, which I think is wonderful, but I also think creates a huge issue because you don't have contact with people who would be able to build out your product for you. So if we take the women's health lens away from it, say if you were like, I'm going to build a B2B SaaS, what you would do if you were a non-technical founder, the first thing is you would probably look for someone technical, right? So you would go to hackathons, you'd go within your own network, and you'd source people who would be able to build out the technical platform for you. The problem when this translates to health tech, and then even more in women's health, is that unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, the majority of these people are male. I think that's just the natural demographic of people who work in computer science, coding, AI nowadays. So to pique their interest enough for them to come on as a co-founder or as a first hire for you is really difficult. And it's difficult to sell the vision to someone who doesn't inherently care, right? Because
Mhm.
we're not really tempting them with a salary that's going to be competitive for these big tech firms. You're really needing to bring them on because of the vision and the mission. And I guess the issue is now that because there's a lack of people who have a technical background, who share the vision and the mission, or potentially just, I mean, like if I came from a technical background, I would probably find it more risk free to stay in a big tech firm as well with like a very comfortable salary and like a good retirement package. So they're unwilling to take on the risk. Maybe, let's say, for a variety of reasons, can't attract the technical talent. What can you do in absence of those talent, in absence of that talent, that doesn't mean that you're paying hundreds of thousands for some offshore technical development company that is going to overcharge you and then not teach you how to iterate your product from then onwards. So those are
Okay.
the main things we cover.
Thank you so much for sharing those. I think those are very important tips to keep in perspective while building our FemTech products. I was searching for you mentioned like there's an event.
Yeah, we haven't published it yet. I'm still doing the final touches on the PowerPoint with the girl who is leading it. She's a data strategist at quite a well-known firm. So I think it will be a really good webinar. I'll definitely, I mean, by the time if this podcast is out, if we have the event link, I'll definitely send it to you and you can publish it.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So, okay, so back to the thing that we raised a few minutes ago about femtech. So I wanted to get your perspective on this, like why not femtech and what should we label this or not label it at all? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the reason I don't like the phrase femtech anymore is because I think it does. I mean, initially when we were using it, there were a bunch of kind of issues with it anyway. For example, if we thought about like male fertility that was coming under femtech, which is really, I guess, like contradictory to the term in itself. But male fertility was coming under femtech because fertility was seen as a woman's issue. I think still the predominant public perception is that fertility is a woman's health issue, but it's equally a men's health issue.
Yeah.
Um, and also, I think having the stem of the word fem in it in itself is kind of isolating, or for various other reasons, I just prefer the term women's health innovation because I think that just better encapsulates some of what we're trying to talk about. I don't think it's the perfect term, to be honest with you. I don't think we have a perfect term, but I guess, like, personally as well, why I use the term women's health innovation is because in medicine we say women's health services, right? So I think that might also be the reason.
I mean, that's fair. All right. I have no strong feelings about this. So moving on to another question. So what patterns do you see? What patterns have you noticed in women founders, and what do they need the most?
Yeah, I would say women's health founders, compared to the average, seem like they just need a bit more education to get to the baseline understanding. Like, if, for example, if you're looking for a raise, just need some more education, whether that's externally through going to talks or just by, Googling things on financials, technicals, and those are the two main areas, I think, because traditionally we haven't taught those very well.
That makes sense. Okay, especially the financials. So okay, so let's look at things a bit less from the VC side and more from the
Mhm.
clinical side. So
Mhm.
what gaps have you seen in women's health that should be addressed more boldly?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many, right? So if we just think from a disease perspective, we don't
Mm.
have any good medications for a lot of women's health diseases that are developed with those conditions in mind. So, for example, for endometriosis, a lot of times the management will be to have the IUD or the IUS, so the hormonal implant or coil, and that was not developed for endometriosis. That was developed for contraception. So for
Yeah.
me, that's just not good enough. Like, we haven't invested the fundamental amounts of money into R&D for a lot of conditions like this so that we have better management for the symptoms, for their diagnosis, and I don't know, potentially there even is a medication that would resolve the core pathophysiological issue, but we just don't know because we don't have the investment into it. And then other things, like one of my, I guess, personal interests as well is why the speculum that we use for vaginal cervical examinations is designed like that. It was designed by a man
Yeah.
many centuries ago. It was tested in a way that was incredibly cruel. I don't know if you know the history on the speculum,
Yeah.
extremely cruel.
I have
And
that.
yeah. So I don't really understand why we haven't developed a tool. It's incredibly painful.
Somebody developing a tool that's I think is designed after the lotus flower and it's supposed to like go in and then like spread open, which is really, really interesting. And it's supposed to be like less painful and more and it was designed by women. So there's
Yeah, there is hope. I think the issue with these things is always distribution. I think
Mm,
the design part of the innovation is only part of the hurdle. And I
um,
think, yeah, like I've seen lots of good designs. There was this lotus flower design. I've also saw a startup previously, I don't know if they're still in operation, that used a tool that was very similar to a sexual health toy, had a camera at the end that would allow for a viewing of the cervix that was similar but also more comfortable.
mm,
The trouble is distribution and retraining of healthcare staff. So if you think of all the generations of healthcare professionals, so like not just doctors, nurses as well,
mm,
midwives that have been trained on the speculum, needing to retrain all of them and sell them the idea that this new tool of which its predominant benefit is reduced pain for the woman is a valuable enough investment of their time and skill set is a hard sell, right? Because traditionally, women's pain is not actually that monetarily or like valuable for
Mhm.
society. Like whether or not a woman experiences pain is kind of like that's people will say things like, "Oh, that's like part of the experience of being a woman," or like, "Oh, that's too bad, but at least you have a solution," things like that. So you can kind of see that reflected in the types of solutions as well. A lot of women's health conditions, they don't cause that high of mortality, which is death. A lot of men's health conditions cause like high mortality, high death. But a lot of women's health conditions cause a lot of morbidity, which is time lived in life in pain or poor health that doesn't
Mhm.
kill you. So women's pain traditionally hasn't been that convincing of a factor for systems to change the way they function. And I don't have the solution for this on distribution, etc. But it is something that hopefully we are working towards fixing because the speculum is awful. Like it really is. It's so unpleasant to see I mean like having seen so many of them used, having used them myself as a patient, it's difficult for me to believe that this is the best solution.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that, especially when you came from like the morbidity point of view, where we've just like embraced pain as part of the feminine experience. It's just hopefully things get better from here. So moving on from that, that was very uncomfortable to talk about. So you've spoken about reimagining the future of femtech, women's health, as you've already talked about just now. And what feels different about this moment compared to, say, a decade ago?
Oh, compared to a decade ago. So I would say compared to a decade ago, there is way more knowledge, interest, and investment into women's health. That's
Mhm.
compared to a decade ago. Compared to maybe 5 years ago, unfortunately, I think there is less investment. As part of the reason is because um, as a whole, the economy is not doing too well globally, but also we lost a lot of this early momentum that we were having when I think Flo was becoming a unicorn. There was lots of awareness into women's health and how it's been so underinvested for so long. And it was kind of like the new hot topic. And then some of that has passed now. And um, health tech also got a lot of funding around COVID. Part of that flowed into women's health, and that funding is not as abundant now. So I think women's health is seeing the impact as well. I would say one of the good things that came kind of alongside that, not necessarily women's health related, is this awareness that in VC there are very few women in positions of power to write checks. And I think there is a huge push now to have more diverse perspectives in the venture capital space, which I think is a perspective that is persisting and is a good movement.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that. Yeah, the economy these days isn't doing that great, but maybe since Bill Gates put in some money again, maybe there'll be some interest in femtech
Yeah.
here again.
Yeah, for sure. I think if anything, for me, that interest from the Bill and Melinda Gates perspective has partially resparked the conversation, but also if you think about because I guess I haven't seen like a list of companies
Yeah.
or I think the majority of the funding has gone into R&D, which I think is great. But also if you think about the downstream impact of that is that when the R&D kind of pans out, the hope is that lots of this R&D will spin into actual biotech companies or like digital health companies, etc., or devices companies. And the idea is that with this initial large injection of investment, it will have lasting downstream effects.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Uh, okay. I think I actually had a conversation about this with somebody else on the podcast, and she did mention that it is going into a lot of R&D, which is great. But then it's like, how about the people who actually have a product that's readily available that needs more funding to be made more accessible, like you said, with like the distribution of this new designs and getting more people to want to learn how to use them and stuff for their medical practice. So let's see. So we're towards kind of sort of towards the end of the podcast. So how do you think clinicians and investors and everyday women can come together to build not just products but communities that support women?
Yeah, I would say this kind of cross-sector communication
Mhm.
is really the core of how things can start to move in the right direction. I would say right now, I mean, this isn't like a women's health innovation specific problem. I would even say that within women's health, it's slightly better than other sectors. There's just not great communication between like communities of clinicians and third sector, so like innovation, entrepreneurship, businesses, and patients, right? You maybe have communication between two of those three parties at one time, and investors, I guess that's the fourth sector. You might have communication between two or three of these parties at one time, but it's very rare that people sort of come together from such different paths in one room consistently to create solutions. And I think one of the ways potentially that this could be kind of circumvented, of course, is through building your own communities, but also things like hackathons, like roundtables, like those are all really useful in terms of having this conversation because R&D needs to communicate with industry. Like that in itself is already a massive issue. Like R&D, I mean like within academia, like research particularly, does not communicate with industry. They do things in their own silos. And I think in sectors where there's not a lot of funding, like women's health, that's just not good enough because we don't have the funding to build things twice. Like it's just not available. So whatever you're doing at works should hopefully flow into kind of public market sort of accessibility because or else why are you doing the research? And in this process from the start, patients, clinicians should be involved, right? Because why would you research or build something in a silo? You just shouldn't.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's look at things from more of a happy, positive point of view for a second. So, what's like the most exciting or unexpected innovation that you've seen that's emerging in women's health so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the founders I talk to are really inspiring and they all build really great tools. I think I'll just give a few examples. So, like, some of the really interesting ones are trying to build external organ models to mimic the otherwise what would be internal tissue of like women's bodies, so uteruses particularly, to test drugs and small molecules on. I'm sure you've heard of like menstrual health biobanks; those have been around for a while. I think that's really interesting. I
I
think
haven't
there are
heard of
more.
that before. What are those?
Yeah, so essentially they just take it's a biobank. So what they do is they take donations from lots of women's menstrual blood and they study them.
Oh,
They look for markers of disease, to do research and potentially develop treatments. I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting that this kind of exists sometimes outside of academia as well. What else have I seen that's really interesting? I think a lot of just like the fundamental tools that are coming out are really interesting. I think I saw a wearable that was earrings instead of
yeah,
like an ear
too.
ring. That was super cool. I mean, I don't have pierced ears, so it's not applicable to me. But for people who have pierced ears, that's super cool. Because I know things like, for example, Oura Ring has been life-changing for many women in terms of understanding their sleep, for example, their cycles, etc. I think, yeah, all of that is really interesting to me.
All right, awesome. Thank you for sharing those. All right. So if you could leave one message for a woman who's listening to this podcast, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say maybe a lot of what we talked about
Mm.
sounds quite negative, and there are a lot of what feel like really daunting challenges in building solutions for women's health. But I would say, even with the challenges, working in this field has been really inspiring and motivating. And I guess because this is where I found my true passion as well, it's felt really fulfilling, everything that I do, even if it's difficult, even if it's hard, because I feel like by doing something, I'm helping move the sector in the right direction. And everyone has their unique perspective and skill set. And I think the more people we have in this innovation sector, the better, because power in numbers. And I think that was part of the realization when we were having the FemTech boom, was what was thought to be a really small sector was actually giant and had a lot of spending power. And for people that aren't moved by the story of women's individual experiences or collective experiences, they are moved by the power of money. And putting your money where your mouth is, I think, is always a really powerful way of changing the story.
All right. And what, like the part about what we talked about being negative? I mean, is it really negative if that's just like the state of things right now? I mean, yeah, it does, to be fair, it does sound negative, but then it's like, that's why people are building in this space. So,
Yeah, exactly. I think people building in this space see the potential, immense potential. Yeah, unfortunately, it's different geographies, women's health is villainized sometimes as like
mhm,
the sector in itself. But that just means that people who persist in a sector that are villainized are even more inspiring and dedicated and resourceful. They just might not be getting the headlines that you're used to seeing. But I think for me personally, it's more rewarding to build for my passion than for the headlines.
that makes sense. Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I have three more questions for you, and then we are officially wrapping up. So, what would you tell 15-year-old Valerie?
Oh my god, I would say that life expands in a way that you don't expect it to. I think when we think about the trajectory of our lives, we think that things will continue with however things are going right now. But realistically, so much of what happens in your life is out of your control and due to luck. And these are, of course, negative things, but a lot of positive things as well. So I would say because I'm a huge planner, when and I like to think that everything is within my control when realistically it's not. So when you look forward on opportunities, realize that a lot of things you might not see will come into fruition and everything will work out.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what's next for XX Combinator? What's something that you're super excited that you're working on?
Yeah, we just did a pivot within XX Combinator actually. We initially were building XX Combinator as a fund distributor. So we were going to raise grant funding to distribute to companies. But that was really difficult for its own reasons. So going forward, what XX Combinator is going to become is more of a platform that would do everything that you would expect operational support to do for any startup founders: education, PR, giving corporate talks, bringing people together in one room, intros to anyone. So that's what XX Combinator is really going to become. Something we're going to properly launch this fall is strategy sessions. So these are strategy sessions for founders, one off, 45 minutes, because what we were realizing was a huge problem was that people were asking for intros to different people that they thought they needed, but actually had neglected like a gaping hole in their startup founding process because they weren't aware that this other part was necessary. So, for example, a lot of the emphasis is often placed on building product at an early stage, but a lot of times it's not the product that's actually going to slow things down. It's like your lack of audience or core founder market fit or things like that.
Okay.
So going forward, that's what you can expect from us.
That's really cool. Okay, so I slipped in another question last minute. Why the name XX Combinator?
Yeah, because of the really famous accelerator Y Combinator. And we were like, what would be really catchy is building one for women's health specifically that plays off of that name, XX. And I think in the future, it would be great if obviously we could adopt a similar model to Y Combinator where we are able to do like builder retreats and things like that. But baby steps, right? At first, we're going to do things as quickly as we can.
Awesome. That's really exciting. And the final question. So, what's the best place for listeners to connect with you, learn more about XX Combinator, and just catch up on everything that you're up to?
Yeah, so I would say the best place to connect with me is my LinkedIn. I think that's how most people find me. Um, sure there will be like my full name or an image of my face somewhere on this podcast when it's published. So you can connect with me there with XX Combinator. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We have a website with a mailing list, so you can sign up there, or you can just see. Mostly reshare most of XX Combinator's things anyway on my personal LinkedIn.
All right, awesome. I'll leave the links to everything in the description and the blog post that comes up after. All right. Thank you so much, Valerie. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, learning so much about what you're up to, what's exciting, what you wish to see more of in women's health. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for having me.
Hi again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Blush and Bloom. I'm so glad you joined me for this conversation. If you found it helpful, please share this episode with a friend or someone who might need it. Let's keep talking about women's health and working towards better outcomes for all of us. You can find more episodes and resources at www.asele.tech and check out our app at www.asele.health. And you can follow us for more updates on Instagram at asele.tech. Until next time, I'll see you in the next episode. Take care and bye bye.